Okay, so this is a video response to Captain Andy, and a video that he's made, what has YouTube atheism ever achieved? Now, before I play you a clip of the old El Capitano's video, just so that you can get it straight from the horse's mouth, what it is that he's asking, let me say that this is the first part of I suppose, a two-part project. And in this first part, I'll answer the question that he's asked. And in the second part, I'm going to throw a question, I suppose throw a question back to Andy, but throw it a lot wider than that. And I'm going to ask in response, what has online new progressivism ever achieved? And if you want to know why I'm using the term new progressivism and not social justice warriorism or regressive leftism, or any one of these terms which is a lot more in common currency at the moment, I'll explain that at the start of that video. Okay, so let's crack on with this part. Here's a clip of Captain Andy.
And this is for YouTube atheists, anyone who identifies as that or thinks that that's a term that applies to them. Particularly the old guard, talking to people who were here, around 2006 to 2010, that kind of era. Basically, not people who've just arrived on the scene, but people who've been here for a while. What has YouTube atheism ever achieved? I'd be intrigued to know what anyone thinks it's achieved, and I'm a bit inspired to ask this by looking at the state of YouTube as is, looking at all the drama that's gone on, the kind of awful behaviour that is so normalised here, that goes on without question, without challenge, without accountability. All this, and how a lot of this has stemmed from the atheist community. With that in mind, I'd like to know, is there anything good that's ever come out of YouTube atheism?
Okay, so Andy, look, we've had a few engagements in the past, haven't we? I've made a few responses to you in the past. You've made a few responses to me. I don't think they've ever been made in a very friendly environment. This particular video is made in a slightly more friendly environment because I watched your video and I thought that's quite a legitimate question to ask. It's certainly a legitimate question to me to answer because I functioned as a YouTube atheist since 2008, and in those early years, certainly up until Atheism Plus in 2012, 99% of the videos that I made were about that one subject. That was the very reason for me starting to make videos on YouTube, and that was what my YouTube output was all about. So what I would say first off is that I think that you're conflating two slightly different things. You asked the question, which is absolutely fine. It's a damn good question to ask. It's a very interesting question to ask. But then you started talking about all this kind of online nastiness. The first thing that I would say with regard to that is that in many ways, YouTube atheism is kind of dormant now. The same characters might be there. There may be some people like the Messianic Manic, like Bionic Dance and people like that, who that is all of their output still, right? They're still doing the YouTube atheism thing, but they're not involved in the kinds of things that you're talking about there. There are some people, I suppose, like myself, who kind of skirt along both things. Some of my output is still of the traditional output for my channel, and some of it is more in the sort of socio-political realm. That is true. But most of what you're talking about really hasn't got very much to do with YouTube atheism. And that kind of period of YouTube atheism is where YouTube atheism functioned as something that you would recognize as YouTube atheism, I think is mainly in the past. So to address the question to now is really not quite right. And I think you understood that to some degree when you started saying really it's people who were around sort of 2006 through to 2010. You realised that that was quite important because it functioned differently then to how it does now. So I think we need to separate those two things. What I would also say with regard to that is that of all the things that YouTube atheism could be about, it certainly wasn't about, I don't think, policing YouTube in the kind of way, let's make YouTube a marvellous place to be, let's make sure there's no dirty tricks. Sure, there was a certain amount of sanctimony with regard to Christian channels doing certain underhand things, and there's always been that's always been a bone of contention, hasn't it? And every situation on YouTube where there's two parties with different perspectives, they've always accused the other camp of doing things, well, seemingly perhaps some members of their own camp doing the same thing. So I don't think that's abnormal, and you could criticize YouTube atheists for it, but I don't think you can really single YouTube atheists out either for it or as a root cause of that. What I would also say about YouTube atheism is that we've got to be careful what we're talking about here, really, because from my perspective, and I think we need to winnow this down a little bit before we start talking about what it's achieved, is that YouTube atheists aren't just atheists. They are effectively anti-theists. Now, I know that people get a little bit antsy about that term and sometimes don't like to apply it to themselves because they see that term as being more than it actually is. It doesn't mean that you sort of want to kill all theists or want to forcibly stop people from having their religious conviction. What it means by being an anti-theist is that you don't just lack a belief in God, but that you see some benefit in not believing in God. Now, that could be because of the cultural implications, it could be because of the moral implications, it could be because just from a sort of personal perspective, your personal ideology or your personal worldview is such that you regard that believing in something that you regard as erroneous as just a bad thing in itself, that it's better to believe in things that are true than things that you believe in erroneous and than is erroneous. And because you believe that religion is erroneous, then you would rather people didn't believe in that, and that is why you actively go out there and get involved in these kinds of arguments. So YouTube atheism really has always been a kind of brand of anti-theism, I would suggest to you. And it's cashed in some ways on the wave of what was called New Atheism. And in a way, New Atheism was anti-theism through and through, especially if you look at somebody like Christopher Hitchens, very, very bombastic against religion, very, very damning against religion. And as much as his arguments were arguing against some of the philosophical and scientific arguments, as much as anything, it was talking about the damage that religion does as he sees it, right? And that's what that was about. So the difference in many ways between that new atheism as a new anti-theism and what had come before it was that it was a lot more strident. And that's part of what I'll pick up on when I talk about new progressivism in the second video. Okay, but that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about YouTube atheism. Now, for me, this is just a personal thing. There's two answers that I want to give you to your question. The first is that for me, this has always been, surprise, Andy, I'm sure this won't surprise you when I say this, it's always been a rather selfish concern coming on YouTube. I didn't think to myself, let's come on YouTube and change the world. Let's make everybody an atheist, right? Or let's show everybody what marvellous people atheists are. Never anything along those lines. The subjects that I discussed, and that I still discuss in some of my videos. You can watch my response videos to John Lennox recently, some of the ones to Dean Esme and some of the stuff that's in that. Okay, some of these subjects that I've discussed are subjects that have been milling through my head since I was in my early teens. Arguments, discussions, and I'd read about these things and I'd think about these things and I'd try and discuss them with people. But it was in a very parochial way, Andy, because I only really got the chance to discuss with the people who live near me and who generally think like me, and I'm sure you can appreciate that. It's good to get outside of that bubble, isn't it? And suddenly what I uncovered was this world on YouTube that I think had kind of, like you say, started in 2006. It was now 2008. It was quite well developed. And people were discussing these things with radically different perspectives. There was a strong Christian community. There were some Muslims active. There was a strong, and there was so many different perspectives. The evangelical perspectives. There was people like Together for Peace who took on board the Eastern Orthodox Church. Of course, there were traditional Catholics, Protestants. There were all these different people giving different perspectives that you could have these very, very different arguments with. And for me, that was a process of personal growth. Right, to challenge those arguments, that was why at the time, although I subscribed to a lot of other YouTube atheist channels and watched some of their materials because that was useful for me for furnishing and understanding my arguments and the different ways that they could be phrased and the different arguments that people made. I was more interested in the Christian channels and the religious channels and the theists channels because they were providing counters and they were providing their own arguments. And so that was a process of challenge and growth for me, a sort of intellectual growth, if you like. So there was a great deal of selfishness with regard to that, and that still persists in everything that I do. There's still an element of selfishness in everything I do on YouTube. I'm not on some grand fucking crusade, Andy. You might be in your YouTube work, but I'm not. Now, if other people get some growth out of what I do alongside me getting some growth out of it, if they're learning something from me as I'm learning something from them, then that's absolutely brilliant. We're all quids in with regard to that, aren't we? But that's a very selfish perspective, and I don't think that's kind of what you meant. What you meant is it got some kind of positive impact on the wider world? Yes, I think it did have. I don't think it's greatly increased the amount of atheism out there, or sort of as a proselytizing exercise for atheism. I don't think it works. And as I've discussed with you recently on Facebook, I'm a gradualist anyway. I don't believe in going out there. I don't think there's a need to go out there and force atheism. If you look at how it's gone in Europe, in Western Europe, atheism is on the rise generation by generation. And if you look at the statistics, very, very few people lose their religion. What tends to happen instead is that each generation, as one generation falls off the end and drops dead, the generation that replaces them is less religious than the generation that's fallen off the end. So from my perspective, things are moving in the right direction. They may be moving very slowly, but I'm quite happy with that, right? Not everything is going to be perfect by the time I'm dead, but I don't mind. It's moving in the right direction, and I don't really see an issue. I wouldn't really want to try and mess that up, really, or try and force something to the extent that it had a bit of a kickback effect. So for me, it was never about that. And I don't think it works very well. And I don't think the proselytizing element of the atheism stroke anti-theism that's taken place on YouTube has benefited in that kind of way. But where it has benefited is in providing support. And I know that because of the private messages and comments and things that we received, not so much nowadays, but certainly back in the past, in those glory days, Andy, of YouTube atheism, thanking me for the material that I was putting out. People outlining their position that they were in. Very different kinds of circumstances that I'm in, Andy. Circumstances often in parts of the United States more than anywhere else where they are an atheist or they're leaving their religion, maybe after decades of being in that religion. They are one of these few people that do drop their religion. Sort of later on in life. And for them, that can be very, very difficult because a lot of the times it's not from the big sort of metropolitan cities. It's not from the places that already have quite a lot of atheists where the problem lies. It's in more conservative areas where more conservative views are held and where they can't just go and discuss with a couple of friends who are atheists because none of their friends are atheists and their friends won't take very kindly to knowing that they don't believe in God anymore, and that religion and the whole bullshit that goes along with it, the whole, that's maybe the wrong thing to say, but what I mean is the bullshit of going to church and being involved in that community, and then if you lose the religion, where do you go with regard to that community? And it provided a bit of community for these people, and it did provide some support, whether you like it or not. It provided support for these people, and quite a number of them said to me that it was providing support for them and that they really appreciated what was happening on YouTube. Now, if you contrast that, okay, something that I'll mention in part 2 is bound to come up is going to be the Atheism Plus debacle, fiasco. But one of the things that happened with the old Atheism Plus things that I took the biggest objection to is that they were involved in, you could call it movement atheism in the United States. And part of movement atheism in the United States, really part of the main functional role of that was supposed to be to provide support, right, to people leaving religion. Okay? Which is a great thing, and it's something that you don't really need in England, do you? But you can understand why it's needed in the United States, of course. But this is the problem that I had with their approach, and I want to contrast this aspect of their approach to what was happening on YouTube back in the day, was that they had a very, very politically exclusive outlook, and they wanted to impose that, and they saw other atheist groups or atheist related groups, right, humanist groups, secular groups, skeptics groups, which are not strictly speaking atheist groups, but they're kind of related to these things and providing in some ways the same kind of support services is that they saw that they weren't making the same kind of socio-political ideological demands. They were letting people in to these things that held views that they found objectionable. And they would stand behind this kind of tagline of saying, how can we share a venue with people who believe that homosexuality is immoral, for example, right? And while I have some understanding of that, because I have the same kind of views on homosexuality as they have, the difference in perspective is this, is that I look at the kind of support that was needed in the United States and still is, and realise that the people that need the support the most, Andy, are not the people who are living in somewhere like fucking New York who come out as an atheist. It's people who are living in Bible Belt areas. And their views of religion are liable to go one way, but there are a whole basket of social issues which they're not likely to be on board with the Atheism Plus, the Greta Christinas of this world, let's say, and the PZ Myers of this world. And it's a big enough thing, Andy, for them to be able to strike down one of those boxes at once. And if the box that they strike down is getting on top of their religious belief and challenging it, and that might be that might be something that's taking a process that might have taken them 10 years to finally be able to come out to themselves and say, no, I actually don't believe in God. You know, it's going to take it's a big thing to do if you've based everything and the ability of the thoughts of an afterlife and that God's there and he's looking out for you to say, no, actually, I'm abandoning all of that. I'm kind of here on my own now. And that's a big enough thing on its own. That's the kind of person that's going to need support and the kind of person that's going to need support in their community. And you can't expect them the very same day to be on board with all these other issues. You know, so it might be if what you really want to do is to support people coming out of religion, which is perhaps the biggest function that these societies would have with regard to atheism in the United States, is to provide that kind of support. To then deny that support to the very people that need it most on the grounds that they're not on board on all these other issues, which is what they said. They made statements, and I could link you them saying things like, if you're not on board with these issues, we don't want you. Go and find your own spaces. You know, fuck off, effectively. And I don't really find that very constructive. Yes, sure, you can stand behind, you know, your little moral positions and say, well, no, why should we share a venue with people that have bigoted beliefs? You can, but then you're going to achieve nothing, and you're not going to provide the support. And all you're going to do is push these people back again. Maybe push them back into the religion, push them back into all these other conservative values. Whereas if you provided them with some support, it might take another year, Andy. It might take another 5. It might take another 10. It might never happen. But their positions might soften on some of these issues, not least because some of those bigotries, some of those prejudices that they had stemmed from their religious belief. And once they're more secure in losing their religious belief, then they might get into a frame of mind when they can start to challenge some of these other positions that they have. So I would contrast the approach that was taking place in venues like that, a very, very toxic approach as far as I was concerned, a very counterproductive approach as far as I'm concerned, whereas it was a much bigger tent on YouTube, right? You could have these different views, and sure, if you brought them up, you'd be challenged on them individually, but nobody was telling you just had to piss off or that there wasn't a place for you, because it didn't function like that. Nobody can tell you to piss off. You can still take part. You could still be part of what was going on. And so I think it had a very, very important function with regard to that. It isn't fulfilling that function now. Maybe there'll be a resurgence of YouTube Christianity and YouTube religion generally. I actually hope there is, because I enjoyed those debates, and it did mean that there was more vibrancy to the atheism side of YouTube and the anti-theism side of YouTube, which meant there was maybe more of that support. Okay, I hope that's answered your question, and I hope, Andy, you'll watch the second part of this as well. Okay, cheers, thanks for watching, bye for now.